There I stood, blood beginning to boil, watching this woman in her spotless white BMW wave a violation notice like she owned the world. The day Margaret Thornfield slapped me with a $200 fine for parking in my own cabin was also the day she unknowingly handed me the keys to destroy her entire HOA empire. The metallic clang of her new gate rattled through the crisp autumn air as she blocked my bridge, the same bridge my grieving grandfather had built with his bare hands back in 1943. Unauthorized vehicle storage, she declared, pointing at my truck parked on family land that had been passed down through 3 generations. What Margaret didn't know was that I owned the only bridge connecting her precious subdivision to the rest of civilization. Every single one of those 47 homes, with their $400,000 price tags, had to cross my property to reach the outside world. My name is Jake Morrison. I'm 34, a structural engineer who specializes in building bridges, and that detail would soon become very important. 2 years earlier, my grandfather had passed away and left me his 1940s fishing cabin on Pine Lake. It sat on 3 pristine waterfront acres, accessible only by a single-lane bridge that crossed Whisper Creek. I traveled constantly for work, constructing renewable energy projects overseas, so visits were rare, but that cabin meant everything to me. Grandpa had taught me to fish from the dock, shown me how to recognize every bird call across the water, and spent countless evenings telling stories about building that bridge himself during the war years. The area around the cabin had changed dramatically in the past 5 years. What was once quiet forest and farmland had been transformed into a lakeside subdivision of cookie-cutter estates. Nice enough houses, but nothing like the wilderness sanctuary my grandfather had envisioned. Then came Margaret Thornfield, 52 years old, who had moved from the city 3 years earlier with dreams of becoming the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian of standards. She got herself elected HOA president by promising to elevate property values, which in practice meant measuring grass with a ruler and timing how long visitors stayed. Margaret drove a spotless white BMW X7, kept her nails perfectly manicured, and carried a leather portfolio as if she were closing million-dollar deals instead of hassling neighbors about mailbox colors. She had a way of sneering at my cabin, calling it that rustic eyesore when she thought I couldn't hear. The classism was subtle but unmistakable. When I returned from a 6-month project in Denmark, I found a brand new gate blocking the road to my bridge. Concrete posts, heavy metal, and a loud clang that echoed through the trees every time it slammed shut. Margaret was waiting with her portfolio and that expensive perfume cutting through the pine scent. She handed me an official-looking document claiming the bridge road was now community property based on a recent surveyor report. According to her, road maintenance was the HOA's responsibility, which meant they controlled access. The violation notice demanded $200 for unauthorized vehicle storage, plus $50 for every day I didn't comply. "I'm sure you understand," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We simply can't have unauthorized vehicles cluttering our community roads. It's about property values, really." I ran my fingers along the rough concrete of the new gate posts and listened to Whisper Creek babbling below the bridge I had crossed 1,000 times as a kid. The whole situation felt surreal. Most newer residents supported Margaret's iron-fisted style, but the old-timers who remembered the land before the subdivision were quietly sympathetic. One of them, Betty Chun, a retired teacher, slipped me a note as I walked back to my truck. "Check the county records. Something's fishy." As I drove away over the gravel, I was already planning my next move. Margaret had made one crucial mistake. She assumed I was just another pushover who would pay up and shut up. She had no idea she had picked a fight with someone who builds bridges for a living and knew exactly what kind of paperwork goes into owning one. Within a week, a cease and desist letter arrived from a fancy lawyer, claiming my continued trespassing was endangering children and demanding that the fines, now ballooned to $450, be paid immediately or face legal action for property damage and public endangerment. Margaret was also busy at the town coffee shop spreading rumors that I was unstable and making threats. Instead of storming over to her house, I did what engineers do best. I gathered data. At the county courthouse, under buzzing fluorescent lights, I spent 3 hours digging through old property records. What I found was perfect. Grandpa's original 1943 deed didn't just cover the cabin and 3 acres. It specifically included ownership of the entire bridge structure, described down to the type of timber and the depth of the foundation pilings. The HOA surveyor had conveniently omitted that detail. Even better, the deed contained an easement clause requiring me to allow reasonable access to anyone needing to cross. Grandpa had always been fair, but reasonable was explicitly defined as no more than 12 vehicles per day. The subdivision had 47 homes, most with at least 2 cars each. The math was devastating for them. Easement rights are almost always upheld exactly as written in the original deed. Courts respect that fine print for a reason. When I realized I effectively controlled access to half the subdivision, I smiled for the first time in days. Margaret wasn't finished, though. She installed a security camera pointed at my bridge, started logging every time I crossed my own property, and pressured residents to sign a petition demanding I cooperate with community standards. Most signed just to make her leave them alone. A few longtime residents began approaching me privately. Tom Hendress, a Vietnam veteran, told me how Margaret had harassed him about the size of his American flag. Sarah Walsh, who worked for the local newspaper, said Margaret had tried to get her fired for an article on property rights. An elderly couple, the Kowalskis, had been forced to remove their bird feeders. It became clear this wasn't really about my bridge. It was about a pattern of bullying that had been going on for months. Margaret's next move was financial warfare. She filed a complaint claiming my bridge was structurally unsafe and demanded an expensive engineering inspection costing over $3,000. Pushing for an emergency assessment on all residents. She even whispered that my overseas work was suspicious. Challenging a bridge engineer on bridge safety is never wise. I spent a full Saturday inspecting Grandpa's bridge with professional tools and cameras. Every joint, every beam, every stress point was documented. The structure had been overbuilt for 20 tons, strong enough for a fire truck. Meanwhile, Margaret's own deck had obvious code violations visible from the bridge approach. When she tried to get the town council to condemn the bridge, the petition turned out to contain forged signatures and people who thought they were signing up for a barbecue. Her attempt at a restraining order was laughed out of court for lack of evidence. I had been recording my calls in our one-party consent state. During one conversation, Margaret's lawyer accidentally admitted they knew I owned the bridge, but were counting on me not understanding my rights. "We're banking on this guy not knowing his rights," he said. Wrong bet. As the pressure mounted, Betty Chin revealed she was a retired paralegal and offered to help. Together with Tom, Sarah, and a few others, we formed what we jokingly called the Bridge Defense Committee. We met at Betty's kitchen table, drinking her lethally strong coffee and poring over documents. Sarah discovered the HOA was spending nearly twice its income, including a $40,000 landscaping project that was mostly decorative boulders. Then Betty found the real bombshell, $23,000 missing from the reserve fund, traced directly to Thornfield Consulting Services, Margaret's own company. There were no contracts, no work product, just money flowing into her pocket. The bridge fight had never been about standards or values. Margaret needed a distraction while she embezzled from her neighbors, and I had been the perfect outsider scapegoat. With proof of ownership, harassment, and now embezzlement, the power shifted completely. Margaret's lawyer quietly withdrew. Board members began distancing themselves. Her husband started asking questions about their sudden wealth. We built a coalition of 31 out of 47 homeowners. I visited each one personally, letting the facts speak. We prepared a 3-pronged legal strategy: a formal complaint to the state attorney general, a demand for a forensic audit, and civil claims for harassment, defamation, and interference with property rights. I also produced a comprehensive professional bridge inspection report backed by an independent colleague. Margaret grew desperate. She hired a contractor to install concrete decorative barriers that blocked my truck. I obtained an emergency injunction. The judge ordered them removed within 24 hours and fined her $2,500 for contempt when she argued. She retaliated with anonymous tips to inspectors, noise complaints, and attempts to get my engineering license revoked. None of it stuck. Then she tried to physically damage the bridge at 3 in the morning with a crowbar. My security camera captured everything in clear detail. I shared the footage quietly with the remaining board members. 2 more resigned immediately. When she launched a smear campaign with anonymous social media accounts and fake reviews, the community grew disgusted. Betty's banking contacts uncovered forged loan documents and signatures. Margaret even tried to bribe me with $15,000 over the phone, accidentally confessing to more irregularities on a recorded call. Her final act was calling emergency services at 2 in the morning, claiming the bridge was collapsing. Fire trucks and ambulances raced out, waking the neighborhood. When the fire chief arrived and I performed a 10-minute inspection, he publicly declared the bridge safer than most county roads and warned Margaret that filing false emergency reports is a crime. The next morning, the forensic audit results came in: $31,000 in unexplained expenses, all traced to Margaret through fake invoices. State investigators filed criminal charges for embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and false reports. Federal authorities began reviewing tax and mail fraud angles. At the packed emergency town hall, with news cameras rolling, I presented a clear timeline of harassment, the original deed, and the financial records. When I played the recorded bribe attempt, Margaret lost control completely, screaming about conspiracies in front of 200 witnesses. The mayor ordered her to sit down. She was led away in handcuffs while cameras captured every moment. Margaret eventually pleaded guilty and received 2 years in prison, 5 years probation, and was ordered to pay $47,000 in restitution. Her real estate license was revoked, and her marriage ended. Within 30 days, the community elected a new HOA board with Betty Chun as president. They restored financial health, ended the harassment, and turned the area around the bridge into a protected wildlife habitat and community gathering place. We held the first annual Bridge Festival that October, raising money for veterans, complete with picnics, children's chalk art on the approaches, and laughter echoing across Whisper Creek. I opened a local engineering consulting firm to help small communities with infrastructure and property rights issues. The story inspired HOA reform conversations across the state, and Grandpa's Bridge was later declared historically significant. Looking back, this was never really about one man's access to his cabin. It was about whether ordinary people would stand up to a petty tyrant who believed the title gave her the right to steal and intimidate. Sometimes it only takes one person willing to fight back, with patience, facts, and the truth, to give an entire community permission to stop being afraid. The bridge still stands strong, connecting more than just land. It connects a neighborhood that learned it could heal, resist corruption, and build something better together. Now I'd love to hear from you. If you've ever dealt with an overreaching HOA or a neighborhood bully who thought they were untouchable, share your story below. You might be surprised how many of these situations follow the same pattern. And if this tale gave you the courage to stand up for what's rightfully yours, remember, some things, like a well-built bridge and the truth, are meant to last.